Welcome to Deeper with Pastor Scott and Pastor
Don. No.
Pastor Don, you look a little older this week.
Aged quite a bit this past week.
I think he looked a lot better.
Of course, absolutely. We actually have Pastor Jim joining us today because he joined Pastor Scott for preaching over the weekend. So he gets to shed some wisdom.
We did a tag team, and I thought Pastor Jim did a great job, and lots of people did. Now, as people are signing in, because there's a question that has come up about your part of the sermon. Nobody questioned my part of the sermon.
No.
It's just you.
Yeah, it's kind of amazing to me that in 40 years of ministry, active ministry, people were suspicious about the tall tales that I would share with them, and began to question everything as to whether it was true or not. And
are you really who you say you are?
And now that's actually happening here at Good Samaritan as well. And it may be because of all of the Good News at Noon stories I told about the good news from Fox Hill, Wisconsin, which were indeed not true stories, but like I like to say, stories of truth.
Yeah.
Well, the stories that I shared for this past Sunday, the story I shared about the children's sermon, indeed was a true story. And much of it now, some of it is based upon how I remember it happening, and I made up some names of the kids and that kind of thing.
Protect them.
That's right. But the actual occurrences and parts of the story that I told were actually happened.
Awesome.
So much so that it became something that I'll just never forget.
Yeah. Well,
It was that kind of an experience.
Well, before we kind of dig more into that, let me just say, too, if you do have any questions other than was that true?
A true story.
Feel free to type them in there, and we'd be happy to respond. The whole purpose of Deeper is to dig a little deeper if you've got some questions like that. But it's kind of a chance to go back to the sermon and maybe just tell it in a little bit of a different way as well. But some of the people are listening to our podcast right now, and it's Good News from Good Sam, our podcast. Tommy, where can they find? Well, if they're listening, I guess they found it. But
True.
for the people watching on Facebook,
You can, if you're not familiar with locating podcasts, it's linked on our website at goodsamlb.com. Or if you do listen to podcasts, we are on all of the podcast platforms. Apple Podcast, Google Play, and
do
Spotify, and we're on all of the main ones. So,
cool. And for those of you who go, what is a podcast? It's kind of like a radio show.
Yeah.
Basically, it's a radio show that you can play whenever you choose to.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, so welcome to our podcast listeners as well. And so just a little background, we spend a couple weeks each year emphasizing, talking about what we call stewardship. And that's kind of a churchy word. And the way I like to maybe explain it is how do we manage? How do we steward? How do we manage the gifts that God's given to us? And then, the church, sometimes people say church is always asking for money. I talked to a woman who was in church for the first time this last week.
Oh.
And I said, I kind of apologized to her, and she said, I thought it was great. She said, I love this place, and thought it was great. So that's a good sign.
yeah.
Nice.
And that, because I think what you shared, Pastor Jim, especially in the message, was insightful to the Bible reading that we'll reference in a second too, but also in our own lives.
Mm-hmm.
How can we take that Bible passage, which was from Matthew's Gospel, chapter 25, and then apply it into our own life too. So we're talking about generosity. Our stewardship theme, if you will, is generosity makes a difference.
Yeah. When you told me that we would be doing something on stewardship, my first reaction was, ugh.
It's that way for a lot of
You
people.
want me to do something on stewardship. But then when you rephrased the whole thing and re-envisioned it as generosity, then that got me thinking a whole lot more. And it made me realize that people may be reluctant and even refusing to talk about personal finances.
Yeah.
But they are very open to understanding what it means to be generous and to share what they have. And it's a dichotomy, I think, But to use the church word of stewardship is sometimes necessary, but to rephrase it as generosity, I think really touches people closer to home.
Well, and I know Pastor Gunn would join me, we really have to give hats off to Joe Gilbert, who was in a video. Joe's a member of our congregation, serves on our stewardship team, if you will. And Joe attended an online session, I think sponsored by our synod, which is kind of our organizational structure within our church that we belong to, the ELCA. And he came back and he said, I really liked hearing them talk about generosity. And so that's why we went there.
Yeah.
And I just want to say at the outset, as I did during the sermon too, thank you to you folks who are watching Facebook Live now, those of you listening on the podcast, because many of you are generous to Good Samaritan. And that's what has allowed us to build a sanctuary in the middle of a pandemic. Our school has actually increased in enrollment, and some of that's related to the pandemic too, because people have been looking for some different options. But a lot of times people are also looking for a Christian option for school. It's a great school, but they have Jesus time every day too, and that's a key. So our campus has grown, our facilities have grown. I think the number of people we reach in person and online has actually grown, and that's not true for, unfortunately, a lot of churches right now because of the pandemic. So we feel blessed because our people have been so generous, and we'll wrap up the sermon too, saying where does that come from? Why does that happen? But maybe we'll just let's get to the Bible reading.
Sure.
And I forgot to say, Tommy's always got questions too. So, I mean, tough ones she brings.
Well, I kind of wanted to add on to you talking about how our church is pretty generous. I mean, Randy commented that kindness is infectious, and I think that generosity can be contagious like that too. You know, I think when you come into a church that you see as so like financially generous and like generous with time, it makes you want to do that as well, because you kind of want to be a part of this big thing that's taking place.
I absolutely agree. And in fact, Pastor Jim was here yesterday, and his wife Krista, along with some other people, generously giving of their time, which is another part of our stewardship. It's how do we manage our time? And there were a number of people working here on Operation Christmas Child, and packing up the gift boxes or go to kids overseas. And it is infectious. That's a good thing.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
So the Bible reading, Pastor Jim, was from Matthew chapter 25, and why don't you tell them?
It's Jesus' parable of the talents, and it has to do with a landowner who is planning a trip and leaving his assets with servants so that they could be good stewards of those assets. And to one he gives 5 talents. And I did explain to the children in the children's sermon that a talent in this case is not necessarily being able to ring bells or being able to sing in the choir, but it was a coin. And the coin was a very valuable coin, worth today somewhere in the neighborhood of $1,000.
I mean, that puts a totally different perspective.
It does,
because when we hear the word talents, unless you have that perspective, it's like, well, so what?
Yeah, and to consider the enormity of the coin itself fits into the whole idea of generosity that we're able to develop then. So to one servant he gives 5 talents, $5,000, to another 2 talents, $2,000, and to another 1 talent, with the instruction that they put this to use so that his property, his kingdom can increase. Okay? And I think that's really the point of the parable that Jesus is telling us. And it has nothing to do with any kind of condemnation of the last person who doesn't do anything with it, but rather an encouragement for those who did do something. The one with 5 talents multiplied it by 2 and was able to provide back 10 talents to the master. And the one with 2 talents multiplied it by 2 and was able to give 4 talents back to the master. And they were commended for doing that. But then the person who was given just 1 talent buried it and was afraid of what the master would do when he came back, and upon being able to make a reckoning to the landowner, to the master, gave back the 1 talent, and then was reprimanded for not doing anything with it.
You know, as you said that, it kind of reminded me, and Tommy can attest to this, but Pastor Don and I feel that way. I think our church councils felt that way. As we try different things here, not everything works, but to not try to do something with the gifts God's given us, we kind of think is a mistake.
Right.
You know, and sometimes we'll try and go, well, we need to tweak it a little bit, or this could be better, but you know, we've added a lot even during the pandemic. And sometimes we go, well, I'm not sure if that's reaching many people, but then we'll hear from you and others and go, we really like Good News at Noon, or we really like you know, Good Sam Praise and stuff. So I think we are designed to use those times.
So do you think it's fear that kept that one person, that one who had the 1 talent, from kind of doing something with it? Because I feel like that could parallel over to, you know, churches or even to our own lives. Like, but what if it doesn't work?
Exactly.
Then I'm going to be out everything, you know? So is that kind of what was...
Yeah, it makes you wonder if part of the parable could have been somebody given 3 talents who invested it and lost money, and the landowner comes back and says, I'm disappointed, but I'm proud of you for trying to do something, right?
Yeah.
I do think fear is the motivation for the one servant to not do anything at all. Yeah.
So, Pastor Jim, you helped, I thought, and this is the part that is a true story. So tell them how you applied that in that children's sermon. And where was that? Upstate New York?
Yes, it was a church that I served in upstate New York, yeah. And, you know, it's sometimes just easier for me to come up with a sermon for the adults than it is to do something for the children. And so I spent a lot of time thinking about how I could make this parable applicable to the kids. So I explained to them, just like I just did, the background of that. And then what I decided to do was that I would give $1 to each of the children and ask them to do something with it during the next week to build up the kingdom of God, to express their faith, and then to come back next Sunday and to share with us what they did with that $1.
I think that's cool.
I thought it was a great idea. Until that Sunday morning, I'm sitting in my office before the service begins, and I'm thinking, something's wrong here. There's something wrong with this. And then I realized it was the person who was given just the 1 talent who didn't do anything with it. And I go, oh, that's kind of like sending a mixed message to the kids. And kids pick up on mixed messages, for sure. So I thought, well, okay, I can give them $5 each, just like the parable. Only nowhere did I have 10 $5 bills, because I usually have 7 to 8 kids at a children's sermon. So I went to the ATM at the bank, and the ATM only gives out $20 bills. So I got 10 $20 bills, which was good because there were 9 kids then at the children's sermon that day. And they just about used up all of my $20 bills. But then, yes, I gave each one of the children a $20 bill and told them to use it for the sharing of their faith, for the building up of God's kingdom, for help in the church, and to come back next week and tell me how they use it.
I would have loved to have seen their eyes, because I mean, $20 is not a small amount for a young...
Yeah. Well, and when I do a children's sermon, I'm talking only to the kids, you know, and they're the only, and I do that deliberately. They're the only ones who know what we're talking about, basically, and that's because adults will strain to hear what's going on in the children's sermon more than they will in the adult sermon. So the adults really didn't know what I was giving the kids, and that's why the example of Joey, the first child, was that he goes back to his seat and the father sees a $20 bill and says, oh, Pastor Jim made a mistake. You know, he didn't give everybody a $1 bill, he gave Joey a $20 bill. That must have been a mistake. And so that led to Joey's putting the $20 bill into the offering plate that day.
So he did that day?
That day, yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
okay.
Because the dad was certain that it was a mistake and said, you've got to give this back some way. And, Joey, why don't you put it in the offering plate? And I think that was just not a matter of how are we going to get rid of this $20 bill, but also teaching his child that giving in the offering plate is a way of continuing the church, of building up the church.
Yeah, and he gave everything that you gave him back.
Yeah.
So really, and so the point was in the sermon, the outline was generosity is about giving.
About giving,
It's about
yeah.
giving. And that's obviously very true. I shared, and I'll just read the Bible verse that we shared on Sunday too. In Acts it says, I showed you in all things that you should work as I did and help the weak. I taught you to remember the words Jesus said, it's more blessed to give than to receive. Generosity is about giving.
And we had talked in planning out this sermon that it was also Confirmation Sunday.
Yeah.
And maybe that would be a good message for the confirmands as well, to know that they are adults in the congregation.
Yeah, Pastor Don told them they're adults.
Yeah, that's
He
right.
didn't say they have to give. But
That's right.
But that is part of the idea
Yeah.
too. All right, so then there was a second child.
Yeah, then the second child, and this is more a case of a childlike kind of reaction to it, and I'm not certain exactly what she bought for her friends. I just said it was ice cream, but I don't remember exactly what it was. But she bought something to share with all of her friends. And she was kind of shy about it too, because she didn't really think that met the requirements of what I had told her to do.
But I love what happened.
Yeah. And so I said to her, well, how is that building up the kingdom? How is that expressing your faith? And she said, well, it is sharing. And I thought, well, okay, that's all right. That's a good thing. And then she added on to that. So when I shared the ice cream with everybody, one of my friends said, where did you get the money to be able to buy all this ice cream? And she answered that she got it from a pastor at her church, and then the friend wanted to know which church she went to, because the pastor gives out $20 to people.
That's great. But
Yeah.
that was enough. It was curiosity, and then obviously, because the friend ended up there, right?
Well, the next Sunday, there were more than 9 people at the children's sermon, hoping that I would do something like that again. Yeah.
But I was thinking about that even as we're on Facebook Live right now. You can share. Right?
Yeah.
One of the ways that you can help expand God's kingdom, whether it's on Facebook Live or listening to the podcast, is sharing that. And that's one of the great things. I know not everything's great about social media, but one of the great things is that it's really easy to share a positive message about the gospel by simply hitting the share button and liking and things like that. And Tommy knows all about that.
Yeah, well, I was just going to say, even like, was it Cindy that had that?
Mm-hmm.
She came back kind of like, I shared, like, is that enough? And I think that is enough, like sharing what we have on our social media, and it can impact someone in a way, even if it feels insignificant, it's actually not.
Yeah. Well, and this just came to me too. Darren Bradford, our music director, is having a concert on Saturday night. It's not a church service, it's just a concert. I shouldn't say just a concert,
No.
but it'll be a great concert. I hope you can come. But I know one of the women who's been a more recent visitor to our congregation told me that she's bringing a number of friends to the concert.
See?
And that's sharing
Yeah.
in that sense too. So it might be to an event at church, it might be through a post on Facebook, but it's a way that we can share in that way too. But generosity is about sharing.
That's a church I would like to go to.
Yeah.
That's the reaction to sharing.
Yeah. The Bible, a different Bible verse other than from Matthew 25. I love this from Proverbs 22, verse 9. Generous people will be blessed because they share their food with the poor. Now that's one example of how that sharing might happen, but a lot of people do give of their resources here to help feed the poor. But there's a blessing that comes from that too, and we don't preach that that's a financial blessing, but it's a spiritual blessing. I think it's a knowing that because we've been blessed, that we can be a blessing to others, and then that ends up being a blessing to us too. So I love that. Generous people will be blessed because they share their food with the poor. What about the third child?
Yeah, the third child is Marissa, and that really is her name. And the only thing that was inaccurate in my description is that Marissa was not 8 weeks premature. Krista reminded me she was 12 weeks premature. 3 months premature. And so that's why this was such a very, very serious situation, and why her parents had me come into the NICU to baptize her at that point. But one of the joys about being in a long-term pastorate, I was at this 2 churches for 31 years, is that you get to see people grow up, not only in age and maturity, but also in faith. And the story about Marissa is absolutely true. And what I liked about it is that it corresponds to the shoe boxes that we're doing here at Good Samaritan too. We collected up shoe boxes for the Albany Maritime Ministry. After the Saturday night service, somebody came up and said, "I didn't know there was a port in Albany, New York." It's on the Hudson River, and we do have many container ships and things like that come into the port of Albany with an actual seafarer's mission there as well. And they're the ones who collect up these boxes for Christmas for sailors from all over the world who are far away from their family. And our 2 churches have been active participants in it. It's really something that people can identify with and easily participate in.
And it's kind of the same with Operation Christmas
Yeah.
People love doing it.
So we would collect up these boxes like 3 weeks before they were due, and we would just add them to the altar area. And then on the Sunday that I would deliver them to the Seafarers Mission, we would have a blessing of the boxes, and people just really associated with that. So Marissa had decided that she was going to use her $20 to fill a box for the sailors. And then she and her mom went shopping for that. And what happened was that as they're thinking about what to put into that one box, her mother is kind of doing some thinking and praying herself. And she goes, "Well, if Pastor Jim gave my daughter $20, maybe I should give my daughter $20 also." And so now Marissa had $40 for 2 boxes. And what I didn't share that I think is kind of interesting is that the day before, my wife Krista and our grandson Slater went shopping for our shoebox here. And as they were leaving, Krista said to me, "Well, Slater's going out to buy things for his shoebox. Pastor Jim, shouldn't you be giving $20 to him?" I go, well, yeah, I guess I have to do that. And so Slater was able to do that. But the neat thing is that as she and her mother are talking about what to put into the shoebox at the food court while they're having lunch, somebody next to them, the table next to them, overheard what they were talking about and came over and said, "I'd like to share with that too," and gave her another $20.
Oh, wow.
Love that.
And so now Marissa had $60 for 3 shoe boxes and brought them in that day and said, "This is what I did with my $20. It became $60. And generosity, when blessed by God, becomes multiplication. Yeah.
I love that. And I mean, who knows how those lives were touched by that too. And maybe more multiplication took place too. And so I love that. We shared the Bible verse, obviously one of the great stories of multiplication in the Bible. And I took it from Luke's gospel, the 5 loaves and 2 fish.
Yeah.
Jesus took the 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, and looking up to heaven, he thanked God for the food. And then he divided the food and gave it to the followers to give to the people. And they all ate and were satisfied. And what was left over was gathered up, filling 12 baskets. And it's not just 5,000, it's 5,000 men.
Plus
the women and children. So, I mean, amazing multiplication happened.
Well, and I think too, I think all of these examples is the generosity. It's a heart thing. It impacts the heart of the person who's being generous, but then it impacts the heart of the person who's on the receiving end, and even that person who overheard, like their heart was impacted by hearing the generosity of Marissa. And so obviously those 3 boxes went to these sailors, but even the hearts of the 3 people involved, the generosity and impact to them, even if they weren't receiving the actual tangible thing,
And people have hard times with the miracle stories in the Bible that Jesus performs. And I think it's because they don't see miracles happening in their own lives, which happens all of the time. And that, in the story of the feeding of the 5,000, here you have hungry people that Jesus wants to feed, and a little boy with 5 loaves and 2 fish, who is willing to share, who is willing to be generous and to share with others. That's the start of the whole miracle, his generosity.
Yeah. One little boy. Willing to give, willing to share.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And so, when $20 becomes $60, you can explain how that happens, but it's no less a miracle of what's going on.
Yeah. No, that's cool. I love that. We ended with a Bible verse that, as I was thinking about the message and that, I'm kind of digging around searching, I found it from what's called the Message translation. And I love how Romans 11 reads when Paul says, "Have you ever come on anything quite like this extravagant generosity of God? This deep, deep wisdom. It's way over our heads. We'll never figure it out." And this is the reminder to us. Everything comes from him. I mean, we believe as Christians that everything we have is a gift from God, including our faith, including our salvation, life to come, but everything that we have is a gift from him. Everything happens through him, and everything ends up in him. Yes, yes, yes. And so we concluded by saying that God's generosity is extravagant. And what Jesus did on the cross, because of his love for us, is, I don't think any more, I couldn't go anywhere else for a more extravagant example of God's generous nature than what Jesus did for us. And that's the basis for our generosity.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, we don't want people to give because they feel guilty, right? We want them to be generous because they understand God's been so generous to us.
On Saturday night, I added in John 3:16 at this point, and just to emphasize, God so loved the world. Just take that. That's a statement of ultimate generosity.
Yeah.
God's ultimate generosity. God so loved the world that he gave Jesus into our world. Wow.
Yeah.
And our generosity is a response.
Yep.
Not to earn anything, but a response to the generosity that God has already shared with us, especially in the gift of Jesus.
Yeah. And this just, it came to me because yesterday I was visiting with John and Lynn Davis, and they just lost their son, Josh. They've lost both of their boys. And Lynn, we were talking about the service that's going to be coming in January. And Lynn said, "So Pastor Scott, what do you say after other people?" And I said, "Well, I want to share God's promises." And she said, "Good. That's what we need to hear." And she said, "I want people to hear the gospel," because she said that was so important to Josh and it's so important to us. And I was thinking about that last night and coming into today. So in the midst of their grief, they're being generous in this time of grief for them by saying, "Please let the faith, the story of Jesus be shared," because there's going to be people all over the world watching this live stream, because he had friends everywhere. So
Wow.
it just multiplies.
Yeah.
It continues. So, Tommy, did we hit everything, or is there something?
Well, I was just going to say on that sort of topic, I think when you hear, a testimony of someone who has gone through a particularly hard time, it just kind of made me think like, wow, that is really generous of them to use such a hard time in their life to, share this hope, even though it sounds like it's hard to have hope in these tough experiences, like how generous to be able to do that.
Yeah. And I think, it is. I loved the story, the stories, and how those kids responded. What a great thing.
After you finished, I actually I had sort of like self-reflecting. I wonder what I would do if I was like younger and given $20. I wonder like what my choice would have been to sort of do there. Or, I even think like, I wonder what I would do if I happened upon a large sum of money now as an adult. Like, what would be my first reaction?
Yeah.
So it really had some like self-reflection going on, hearing those examples.
Yeah.
That's good.
Out of the mouths of the children, right? Yeah.
Well, thank you everyone for tuning in today for Deeper at noon on Facebook. For those of you listening to the podcast, Good News from Good Sam. And again, the Bible passage for the parable of the talents from Matthew chapter 25, verses 14 through 24, if you want to dig into it there. Or tell me, if they want to watch the actual sermon, where would they find that?
On our website, we have all of the past messages linked there. They're all on our Facebook page and our YouTube page. The easiest way to find all of that is to go to goodsamlv.com.
Great. So go ahead and share that too, and let people know as well. Thank you, Pastor Jim.
No,
Really appreciate
thank you.
that.
Wasn't it fun to do that together,
It was,
Pastor Scott?
It was. He did the best job, and it was easy preparation for me. for preaching. Thanks for
He
tuning in.
made you look good.
Yeah, I know. And that's hard. So thanks everyone for tuning in today. God bless each and every one of you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Have a good afternoon.